Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this morning, A New Era for Environmental Law. This is the first in the series of webinars that we're running this spring in place of our usual in-person ThinkHouse Foundation events. My name is James Hall, and I'm one of the co-chairs of ThinkHouse Foundations. I've recently taken over from my colleague Emma Buffton, and I'm an associate in the employment team here at Gowling WLG. And as you hopefully know, ThinkHouse Foundations is our program aimed at in-house lawyers at the junior end, ranging from trainees and paralegals up to lawyers with around 5 years PQE. And in this series of webinars, we have two more webinars coming up. The first is on Brexit, which is a panel discussion, and that is on Thursday and should give you a really good overview of what you need to know as a junior lawyer now that we are 4 months into the post-Brexit world. And as I say, that's taking place on Thursday. We then have a contract law update, which is on Tuesday next week, the 18th of May. And I hope you can attend both of those sessions as well as today's session. If you're unable to join any of those sessions live, then they will be recorded. So do take a look at those if you can. So moving on to today's topic, as I said, it's a new era for environmental law. And as I'm sure you can all agree, environmental, social and corporate, or ESG issues are very much in the media spotlight at the moment. We have the COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference taking place in Glasgow in November this year. And there have been other recent developments in the area, such as the US announcing it is rejoining the Paris Agreement and the plan to slash emissions of greenhouse gases in half by 2030. So I'm joined this morning by Sam Cooper. He's an associate in the Planning and Environment team in London here at Gowling WLG. And Sam is going to take you through the basics and highlight some of the challenges facing our clients and also offer you some practical tips for addressing those challenges and what to be thinking about going forward. So Sam is going to be speaking for around 35 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. And I'll look to draw the webinar to a close at around 11:15. And before I hand over to Sam, I have a couple of housekeeping points to run through. So firstly, if you'd like to ask a question, then we are using the Zoom Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. So if you just click on that and type in your question, it will be directed to the panel, which is me and Sam. And there's no such thing as a silly question, so please do send them through, and we'll do our best to deal with as many of those as we can before we close. And if we can't get to them, then we'll make sure we follow up with you. So make sure you leave your name and details, and we'll pick those up with you afterwards. And secondly, just to say the webinar is being recorded, so you should be sent a link with the recording shortly after that's all being dealt with our end. And so please do feel free to share that amongst colleagues who couldn't make it today. And then finally, there's at the end of the webinar, we'll be sending you a link to complete a very short feedback form. And please do take a couple of minutes to do that if you can, because we really do read them and they will shape the future sessions that we put on. So we really want to understand what sort of issues you're interested in hearing from us about. And we'll also send that link with the recording if you don't have a chance to do it today. So that's enough from me. And without further ado, I'll now hand over to Sam.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for that, James. Yes, as you heard, my name is Sam. I'm associate in the Planning and Environment team here at Gowlings. Great to have you all here. I think this is something that is becoming increasingly important, but probably isn't talked about enough. Excuse me, in our sort of work context. You know, we hear about the environment and climate change a lot in everyday life. When we watch the news. And in the pub, if you're someone who talks about climate change in the pub, but that tends to be more just sort of, you know, what's going on, what's Trump said, you know, like wind turbines cause cancer, that kind of thing. I wish I was joking, but that is actually something he said. So the trouble with things like climate change and environment is that it's sometimes difficult to relate directly to business. So this isn't going to be a legal update where I'm just going to run through, you know, recent case law or legislation, but rather I just want to discuss how environmental law should be considered sort of in the context of work that might come across your desk and just sort of things to bear in mind as you kind of work through. So I've split this down broadly into sort of environmental risks to consider and how they might have an effect on your business. And then I will just look at a few recent sort of environmental updates and a couple of examples of new environmental legislation, which you should find interesting, and particularly if there are anyone acting for developers, it should be particularly useful for you. But as I said, it's quite pervasive, so it should be useful for everyone. So before I launch into that, I just want to have a quick look at the context that we're dealing with here, specifically sort of in terms of decarbonisation. I think this is a really useful graphic to look at in the first instance, because it shows actually we have reduced our carbon emissions quite significantly since 1990. So it's always nice to know that that what you're doing is actually having an effect. But obviously, as you can see, that is quite a steep decline that we've still got to go there. And in terms of achieving this, I think this next graphic is really useful. Because apart from showing the scale of the sort of cuts we've already made to carbon emissions, I think the difference between sectors is really interesting. You know, power is clearly leading the way, but that's not really surprising. And when we think, when we think of green initiatives, it involves, wind, solar, geothermal, tidal. They're all, we've sort of done the easy bit. There's a reason why those elements have come first. So I think these other big chunks that you can see in where it says CO2 cuts left to go, areas like transport are much harder to achieve those kind of reductions in carbon emissions. And I'll come onto transport a bit more later on. So environmental risks, what do we need to consider? What threats might you need to bear in mind? Threat sounds quite strong, but at the end of the day, that's what we're dealing with here. And as lawyers, risk mitigation is one of our key roles. So while you're considering other risks, financial, regulatory, etc., it's always just worth paying heed to whether there are any environmental risks as well. And that's the one thing I'd say is a key sort of takeaway from this is bear environmental matters in mind as you work through, just as something to always consider. So climate change and environmental litigation, obviously this is probably the slightly more extreme end in terms of a sort of business-based threat, but it's picked up in quite a few jurisdictions over the last few years, and it's been a little bit slow off the ground in the UK, but it is picking up, and there are a few sort of key examples that we can look at. The judicial review challenges for developments, for those not involved in this kind of thing, obviously judicial review is just a review into a decision made by a public body brought by anyone. Anyone can bring a judicial review claim if they have standing. And in this instance, it's sort of planning permissions and development consent orders. So the Heathrow third runway, I think we've all got a bit of a knowledge on. It's obviously had a mixed reception, but one challenge that was made to that was upheld by the Court of Appeal was that ministers did not adequately take into account the government's commitments under the Paris Agreement to combat climate change. Now, the government didn't then take this to the Supreme Court, but Heathrow did. And the Supreme Court subsequently ruled that it had been legitimately based on previous and less stringent climate targets at the time it was agreed. So the Supreme Court overruled the Court of Appeal in this instance. So while the challenge ultimately wasn't successful in this instance, it's something that I think is going to come through more and more, particularly in light of sort of international obligations to combat climate change. Woodhouse Colliery is another one that you may have seen in the news that's come up. This was going to be Cumbria's first deep coal mine for 30 years. Now, planning and history on this one's a little bit sort of unusual and complex. I won't go into it in huge detail, but the plan was essentially initially approved by Cumbria County Council, before then being revisited, and now there is going to be a public inquiry. So Robert Jenrick, relevant government minister, cited advice from the Climate Change Committee, which said the mine would increase emissions and make it hard to stick to government targets. Now, obviously, we don't yet know whether that development will proceed or not, but it's a good example of climate change being at the forefront of a legal challenge. So those are challenges to decisions made by government, but I think we also need to consider private law claims which target certain businesses. Now, historically, this has generally been focused on the energy sector, so the so-called carbon majors, sort of oil and gas companies, but now it's slowly sort of creeping into to take in other companies as well. I think it's just worth mentioning that this is very early days for this in the UK, but it's picking up quite a lot, particularly in the US. One example of that, and so would be the potential, for example, for shareholder claims to be brought as a result of a failure to factor in climate risk in decision making. So that's something that obviously company directors will really need to bear in mind. If it looks increasingly as though their duties will extend possibly beyond their usual obligations to comply with certain sort of regulatory and disclosure requirements. I've also just mentioned greenwashing there, because I think it's well, it's a fun little buzz phrase, but it has come up in the US, essentially just the misrepresentation of one's green credentials. You know, convincing a consumer that something is more environmentally friendly than it is. And litigation based on this has cropped up in the US, but I don't see why it couldn't hop across the Atlantic at some point. So that sort of reinforces the need for accurate disclosures when required. Now, I mentioned earlier that I do want to look beyond just the legal points. I want this to be quite a sort of general overview of some things to consider here. So I think we need to tackle the potential impact that environmental issues can have on a company's reputation in the context of public opinion surrounding climate change, because I think that's changed a lot, particularly in the last few years. I think it's fair to say that we've reached a stage where the majority of the population views climate change as a major concern. And so I don't have figures on it, but I dare say there's probably some data on it. But given the situation, I think we have to consider it a major factor, being essentially the sort of court of public opinion. And in some instances, legislation hasn't necessarily caught up with that. So I just picked out a couple of instances I think are worth looking at here as examples. So one being the recent acquittal of the Extinction Rebellion protesters. I don't know if anyone saw this in the news. We've seen the phrase perverse verdict thrown around, or jury nullification as it's known in the US. You may be aware of that. So the defendants had no defense in law and yet were acquitted by the jury. The jury finding that the damage they caused to Shell's building in their protest, or Shell in this instance, that was a proportionate response to the damage they allege was being done to the environment by the company. Now, whether one agrees with that interpretation or not, is certainly an indicator of public opinion, and suggests that I believe there's around 1,000 prosecutions lined up for Extinction Rebellion protesters. It certainly brings into question what's going to happen with those. Secondly, I was quite interested in this example of action by the public sector, particularly the Ministry of Defence, in demonstrating its commitment to combating climate change via the establishment of a new solar farm to mitigate its impact on emissions. I'm reliably informed by a friend of mine that a Challenger 2 tank uses 6 litres of fuel per kilometre off-road, so that may go some way to explaining why the MOD considers it important. But I think it's interesting that government departments are doing all they can to demonstrate their commitments to combating climate change. So looking at those examples, we sort of need to consider what our customers and the general public think. The government is held to account, and in many ways, the public do the same with private companies. And so I think, in my opinion, the court of public opinion has extended significantly in the last few years. Excuse me, to the point where climate change is among those top concerns. And that applies obviously not just to ourselves, our own companies that we work for, but who we associate with, who we use via a procurement chain. So these are just things to sort of bear in mind. I'll come on to some sort of particular things that we can do shortly, but just bearing in mind public perception and who we work with is certainly a good starting point for that. So in terms of some slightly more practical points that we can consider, what can we do about these risks? I think they're mostly sort of common sense, really. But as I said, it's a relatively new area of law, relatively new area of risk. So make sure that you're the one flagging these issues, because not everyone will be thinking about it. If you've got a concern about and a potential environmental risk, you need to be flagging those. Consider environmental risk assessments. Now, whether you incorporate that into existing sort of risk assessment methods, or if you have a separate process, I think both are really effective and can certainly pay dividends in the long run. And consider provisions in your contracts. I mentioned procurement before, and association, and potential sort of vicarious reputational damage. There may be environmental requirements that that you wish other businesses you work with to adhere to. As I mentioned, close associations can be damaging in the court of public opinion. So obligations to comply with environmental legislation, for example, or indeed to meet a higher standard, might just help to mitigate that risk. Disclosure requirements, I think we can all see those changing relatively regularly. I think we see more and more things will need to be more stringent requirements. So getting ahead of the curve can save a lot of aggravation in the long run. So accurate data recording is obviously going to be key. And as I mentioned, greenwashing is something to avoid. By all means, brag about your environmental credentials, but they do have to be correct. Add climate change to risk assessments. Now that's thinking in terms of not just in terms of a legislative framework that we have to stick to, but also considering the effect actually of climate change and how that could impact your business. Now that will clearly vary a lot depending on what your business is. As I mentioned earlier, there's scope for obligations to consider this as part of any decision-making process. Accurate disclosures. I think they're used because disclosure can be a access of spur to do more oneself, but again, certainly mitigates of compliance and reputational issues. And finally, audit applications for consents and projects. Take a critical eye to them in anticipation of others doing the same. As I mentioned, environmental law is certainly quite pervasive, and certainly in terms of any physical development, just be conscious that there will be others looking at it with their environmental hat on, so you should do the same. So just come to a couple of sort of recent environmental law updates here, examples of the kind of things to think about. I won't spend too long on them, just because they might be weighted more useful for some of you than others. But I'll start with the Environment Bill, because that's, as you can imagine, that's going to be quite important for us. It's been in the offing for quite a while. Quite a few things sort of delaying it recently with coronavirus, etc. But it does bring in quite a few changes. Obviously, can't go through them all, but I think these are some of the key ones. creation of a new office for environmental protection. That'll be an interesting one to watch, because I think that will have the role of advising government, monitoring implementation of environmental legislation, and that applies particularly to local authorities. There is an emphasis in the bill, I think, on local authorities bearing a lot of responsibility for ensuring compliance. Biodiversity net gain is a very big one for developers, and any of you out there, developers among you, will, I'm sure, be aware of this. But essentially, any new developments, there are a few exceptions, but the vast majority of new developments will be required to demonstrate a 10% biodiversity net gain, ideally on site, but where this isn't possible, there is scope for sort of off-site provision. So I think moving forward, we can expect a lot more sort of green spaces, mini nature reserves, and green roofs and green walls and all that kind of thing. You know, beehives on the roof. But I'll come shortly on to how those are actually going to be secured. In terms of air quality, you can see a requirement for the setting of legally binding targets for air pollution. And similar mechanisms for local authorities to monitor sort of smoke emissions and that kind of thing. So greater powers for local authorities. Subject to consultation, I think we'll see a lot more limitations on single-use plastics. So obviously we've had the carrier bag charges for quite a long time now. I can easily see a situation where that charge is extended to packaging as well as just bags. So that's certainly one to consider for any manufacturers. That's going to be key. And as you can see there, government will have the power to force the recall of cars which fail to meet emission standards, but also to set minimum recall requirements. So, you know, when a car is recalled, it has to be a certain number that are actually recalled, rather than just issuing a recall notice. So sticking with biodiversity net gain just for a minute, I just want to come on to conservation covenants, because they are coming forward primarily as a means of securing biodiversity net gain obligations that I just mentioned. If anyone can remember their land law lectures from university, be aware of the difficulty of enforcing positive freehold covenants. I'm not going to go into that in any detail now, obviously, because this is environmental law, and I don't want the number of people listening to drop off a cliff when I start talking about land law. But these kind of offer a way to secure the delivery of biodiversity enhancement. So they secure obligations in respect of certain areas of land. You know, it's entered into as a binding, as a deed, as a binding instrument. And they secure obligations to do or avoid certain activities in relation to certain areas of land. So obviously very important for developers who'll need to enter into them, but also anyone acquiring land or premises will need to consider these and whether that land might be subject to a conservation covenant. Because just as you would with any other covenants or restrictions affecting a property from which you operate, or indeed planning conditions and planning obligations as well, you know, if you're operating from a new office building or an industrial unit, if it's been recently constructed, obviously looking forward a few years, if it's been recently constructed, then that's something you'll need to bear in mind. So then those covenants will then be enforceable by local authorities or other conservation bodies, whoever they, depending on who they've been entered into with. So coming then on to what to expect from future developments. I think key is going to be efficiency in construction and buildings. You know, with just bearing in mind that constant 2050 net zero target, if you can make efficiency savings, then all to the good, and that's, I think, easier than necessarily finding new solutions. Insulation, innovative sort of air conditioning systems and heating systems for skyscrapers, that kind of thing. They're all going to be crucial. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I think transport is where we're really going to need to put in big changes. You saw how much ground there is to make up in the transport sector. So the ban on obviously new diesel and petrol cars will be an interesting one. That's in by 2030. I'll just keep an eye on that one. Your guess is as good as mine as to whether electric vehicles continue to be the obvious successor, or whether we look more at hydrogen. But yeah, and that's one where I think we may well see sort of divides by sector. So that one's obviously going to be important for anyone who's running, operating a fleet of vehicles. When do you update to a new fleet that's going to be compliant with those with new regulations? That's just something to keep a finger on, really. Air quality and particulates. Obviously, in London, we have these low emission zones. I sold my car because of it, but I think they will spread out beyond London. Really, don't be surprised to see them in. Sort of Birmingham, Manchester, any sort of any major cities, as we become more concerned by air quality. Domestic fuel burning. Any of you have a wood burner? You may have seen that the recent ban on the burning of domestic coal and sort of wet or green wood, which is great because they've released lots of PM 2.5, which is the there's a very fine particulates that we're particularly concerned about from a health point of view. Or is the concern then is if people are buying kiln dried wood, then there's obviously a question over how efficient that is from an energy perspective. But you can see, I think, key for these as well is sort of where is the driver for this coming from. Obviously, we're all aware of the importance of air pollution, but when you have instances like this one, this year, in fact, there was this 9-year-old girl who had air pollution listed as very near a main road and had air pollution listed as cause of death. That was the first time that had happened. So I think it's going to be that kind of thing that's going to be the real driver for change, and that will bring home to people why these things are important. So I hope this has been sort of a more of some food for thought, rather than, as I said at the beginning, I don't want to just reel off changes to environmental legislation, because I don't think that's particularly useful to most people, because it is quite specialized. But I hope this just has encouraged you to keep environmental considerations just in the back of your head throughout, and then things might just ping every now and then. You think, oh, there might actually be an environmental consideration element there. So I hope I've demonstrated how pervasive this issue is, and that it does go across all sectors. And it's not just one for tree huggers and property lawyers. And we do all need to bear these things in mind. So every now and then, just whatever you're working on, you can just stop, take a condor moment, and just think about whether there's any environmental element that you need to take forward. And as I said earlier on, you may well be the only person who's thinking about this. So that is me. I think James has been keeping an eye on questions. If you don't want to put it on here, obviously I'm more than happy to pick up with you directly. There's my details, or you can find me on the website. But yeah, if there's any questions, James.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, that was really interesting, very thought provoking. Some really good points there. Yeah, we've had a couple of questions through, but also, yeah, if you do have a question, please do send it through. I'll give you a chance to catch your breath, Sam. But so one of the questions, and it may be a tricky one to answer, but sometimes they're the best ones. But do you have any idea how likely we are to hit net zero by 2050?
Oh, I wish I could tell you. I think it's at this stage it's entirely dependent on technology. I think there is willing, obviously, in government, and I think we've reached a point where environment and climate change is sufficiently important to everyone in the population that it's just a given. No party will ever be elected without a strong plan to reach that target. As with everything, it's with very long-term government targets. There is obviously a difficulty with holding governments to account for making commitments that are that far ahead. So I said, I think the political willing is there, and always will be. But as with everything, there's just that balance between, what's actually realistic, based on economic reality and technology, and what there's actually willing for.
Okay, great, thank you. I guess linking to that question as well, you touched on it a bit earlier about electric cars and things like that, but it was striking to see how much work there is still to do in transport. Do you have any other thoughts on apart from the obvious? We're all going to be driving Teslas or similar things.
Yeah, as I said, I think that's going to be a really interesting one to watch. And I mentioned very briefly sort of sector divides in terms of transport. Obviously, everything at the moment is dominated by fossil fuels, but I think we'll increasingly see different sort of renewable alternatives for different sectors. So electric cars may well be the most appropriate for private transport, but we've seen a lot of advancements in hydrogen technology over the last few years that I think are going to be really important for for freight. Where obviously goods traveling over longer journeys, you can't stop and recharge all the time. So hydrogen is going to be, I think is going to be really important. And I think there's a German company now developing a sort of hydrogen sludge, for want of a better word. It's going to be much more easy to transport. So I think it's very much sort of watch this space, and hope that technology catches up soon.
Great. Okay. Interesting stuff. We've had another maybe more specific question, which is going back to the sort of covenants point that you mentioned, and you touched on that maybe there's an opportunity for landowners and developers to kind of I don't know, engage on that. Do you have any more to say about that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, because I think there's obviously that if you've got you're building a new office block in the middle of a city, it is going to be incredibly hard to demonstrate a 10% net gain in biodiversity on that site, particularly if you're replacing an existing office block. So I mentioned, green walls and roofs and things like that, but sometimes it's just not going to be achievable on site. So if we looked at off-site provision, I think there's got to be a role for someone somewhere. And this is just my take on it, my sort of speculation. I think there's got to be a role for someone to link up those two bodies, the developers and the people with land, with space, that's that has the potential to actually achieve that overall 10% biodiversity net gain. So that will probably, I dare say, there'll be existing companies picking that up, but there may well be scope for someone to specialize in that, I think.
Okay, interesting. Okay, we've had another question which you may have covered, so feel free to repeat some of the things you said, but I think it's helpful just to kind of, and I think we'll probably finish on this question as well because we're running out of time, but it's sort of your thoughts on what the sort of top tips are that you can give really for in-house lawyers to be getting ahead and ensuring that they can be as prepared as possible for future obligations that might arise in the area, and such as sort of regulatory reporting, which I know you touched on. Do you have, I know you've sort of mentioned having that condor moment and thinking about environmental issues whenever you're dealing with broader issues, but is there anything you'd advise just that anyone can be doing now, as it were, to get ahead?
I think just try and maintain a reasonable level of awareness. I'm not suggesting that everyone becomes, an expert in environmental legislation, but I think it's just worth sort of keeping in mind. Well, following legal updates, I think is obviously a good option. We put out quite a few. I don't really what can say beyond that. Really, I mean, just try and keep on top of it as another issue. Try and treat it as important as if it's as important as it is. As financial and as any other sort of regulatory risk. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, health and safety is a really good example.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Sam. Well, okay, that's great. Well, thanks everyone for your questions. And if we hadn't had a chance to get to them, then we'll certainly follow up with you after the webinar. So I'd just like to say thanks again for joining, and thank you to Sam. As I mentioned, please do join us on Thursday for our Brexit panel discussion, and then on Tuesday next week for the contract law update. Yeah, if you do have time to fill in that feedback form just after the session, then that's great. But otherwise, yeah, thanks very much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.